You ever watch this guy on television?
You all were not telling the truth, and you should not be trusted.
Congressman Matt Gaetz, thank you for what you did for your country tonight.
Be offended with the Democratic whip, not House Republicans.
Like a machine, Matt Gaetz.
Welcome to Hot Takes. This is Congressman Matt Gaetz. Let's talk about the news. And the big news is that President Trump has killed FISA reform with a tweet. He writes, "I hope all Republican House members vote no on FISA until such time as our country is able to determine how and why the greatest political, criminal, and subversive scandal in U.S. history took place." So President Trump depriving Nancy Pelosi of the Republican votes she would need to pass these reforms. And I'm glad. You know, if you listen to yesterday's podcast, I really go back and describe the basket of reforms that was initially discussed with the White House when Mick Mulvaney was chief of staff. Mark Meadows has been a champion for reforming this process as a congressman, and now as chief of staff, I think is only in a better perch to man that fight. And I would like to see far more extensive reforms than what was passed out of the Senate, but it was just Richard Burr and Rand Paul voting no out of the Senate. I think every other Republican voted for it. You know, Burr wanted fewer reforms, Paul wanted more reforms. I said I wasn't voting for it because I was of the Rand Paul view that a lot more needed to be done. Hours later, the president kills FISA reform. It remains important to hold people accountable who are involved in Obama-Biden gate and the Russia hoax that distracted our country. And here's the president from the Rose Garden maintaining his vigor and his just absolute determination to find out the truth.
Greatest hoax in the history of our country. And it was an illegal hoax and a very dangerous hoax. And a lot of bad things have been found out about Mueller and the gang. So I would like to hear that conversation. Yeah, I would like to hear it personally. So whatever they want me to do, I'll do. I think Rick Grinnell has done an incredible job. And things are happening now that I always knew this was the answer. This was an attempted coup by a bunch of dirty cops and others. These are dirty cops, dishonest slime bags.
Let's do better and make sure that we build a system worthy of either political party being in power and not tempted to use the intelligence process that is supposed to protect all of us to try to gain political advantage one way or the other. I broke it down on yesterday's podcast. Go take a listen. But President Trump apparently agreeing with the analysis, Rand Paul leading the way, will do better, protect individual liberties, and ensure that no president has to go through what President Trump did. We talked a lot about foreign policy on yesterday's episode, and then we saw John Roberts ask the president a question about the timetable for a return home from Afghanistan. Here's John Roberts and the president's fantastic answer.
Mr. President, is it your intention to bring American forces home from Afghanistan by Thanksgiving Day? And is the Pentagon drawing up plans to that effect?
Well, I think everyone knows we're down to less than 8,000 troops. We're with leadership in many different fields and in many different parts of that country. We're dealing with the Taliban. We're dealing with the president. The president now has gotten themselves straightened out with the two presidents, but we're dealing with, because they had, as you know, they had competing factors and factions. I think we're there 19 years. We're really not acting as soldiers, we're acting as police. And we're not sent over there to be policemen, but we're there 19 years. And I think that's enough, and they understand. We're having very positive talks. We want to bring our soldiers back home. We want to bring them back home. And we're not only talking about there, we're talking about other countries also. We bring our soldiers back home. We can always go back if we have to. If we have to go back, we'll go back, and we'll go back raging. And there we'll go back as warriors, fighters. But right now we're policing, and we're not meant to be a police force. We're meant to be a fighting force.
So again, you can hear my response back and forth to both sides of the argument on yesterday's episode, but I thought the president laid it out perfectly. You heard the president mention Syria, and I am so glad he did.
In Syria, you remember, John, on the border, when I took the soldiers out of the border, everyone said, oh, that's so terrible. Well, I spoke to President Erdogan yesterday of Turkey. The border's been fine without us. They've been policing that border for 2,000 years. All of a sudden, we had thousands of soldiers there doing their work. For what? Guarding Syria and Turkey on a border, a very long border. No, we want our troops back home. We took them out. That was a year ago. I was criticized. Nothing happened, except they're watching their own borders now. We kept the oil, but at some point we'll take care of the Kurds with respect to the oil and get out.
I was disappointed, though, in many of my Republican colleagues, a majority, in fact, who joined with Democrats in a resolution condemning the president's action to remove our country functionally from the Syrian civil war, to get us off this border where armies of tens of thousands had been fighting each other for like 100 years. And I was the only Republican in Congress who took to the floor to defend the president's actions. In fact, the Republican that was managing at the time, Chairman McCall, for our side, he was actually arguing with the Democrats. He was one of the sponsors of the resolution condemning the president. But here was my argument back when the president took the action in Syria that he just referenced in the Rose Garden.
If Turkey is not acting like a NATO ally, perhaps the sensible solution is to remove Turkey from NATO rather than keeping the United States inserted in Syria, presumably forever. This is why I oppose this resolution. I've heard my colleagues say we should not leave Syria without a strategy. Perhaps it is equally logical that we should not stay in Syria without a strategy, because in Syria we have tens of Americans stuck between armies of tens of thousands who have been fighting each other for hundreds of years and who will likely be fighting each other hundreds of years from now. Our mission to deprive ISIS of caliphate land has largely been accomplished with the help of the Kurds and with over $9 billion being paid to the Kurds. The Kurds have been fighting bravely where they live, but they have been trained, funded, and equipped by the United States. And we cannot accept the proposition that if we support a group of people because our interests align in one case, that this somehow morally binds our country to every conflict that they have, past, present, or future. To do this would constrain the utility of America's future alliances, not strengthen them. The blood of America's patriots is among our nation's most sacred currency, and it must be spent only when absolutely vital to protect American interests. We are not the world's police force. We are not the world's piggy bank. I support an America First policy on our foreign policy, and I oppose this resolution. I yield back.
We have spilled so much blood, so much treasure, and it is nice to see a president wanting to have our best people here in our country contributing to their families and their communities and our resources, committed to the successes of all Americans. We do not have an America First objective in some of these countries where we have extensive troop presence, and it's great to see the president share that view that foreign policy restraint can do a great deal more to advance the interests of our country. Twitter, yet again, is choosing to enter the political fray as a fact checker now, indicating that on President Trump's tweets, they are going to provide their analysis of whether or not they believe the content of those tweets to be true. And it really is quite something. I agree with Donald Trump Jr.'s analysis. How about Twitter go and review all those blue checkmark folks who were saying that there was collusion with Russia? You know, that the president was going to be indicted, that his son was going to jail. You know, all that turned out to be nonsense, and none of that was fact-checked. But now that we're coming up on the election, now that coronavirus has impacted the way that we can gather, and obviously the Trump campaign can assemble and gather an energy that we didn't really see in the Biden campaign. And so digitally, we see the stakes higher than they've ever been. More and more, I think that the way communication is going to occur will involve an enhanced digital element. And President Trump has a number of people across America onboarded onto his digital platforms, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, his web platform, people who get his emails. And so it is an important question, not of politics, but of policy. Are we going to continue to treat entities like Twitter, like Facebook, like Google as unbiased platforms, or are they going to take on more the role of a news organization, an aggregator, someone who is creating, enhancing, limiting various content? And the initial play from Twitter seems to be that they're not merely going to provide a place for people to share their ideas. They're going to add their analysis to those ideas, whether you like them or not. And we're perhaps left to wonder whether or not that's going to impact who sees them and when they see them and how frequently they see them. If you go and Google my name, Matt Gaetz, and Twitter and Vice News, we'll throw it up on our social media after the podcast posts. You'll see that 4 members of Congress during the heat of battle in the Russia hoax were shadow banned by Twitter. Devin Nunes, Mark Meadows, Jim Jordan, and Matt Gaetz. When Vice News first reported this, I initially had to actually go and explain to Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, what shadow banning was. It was not something they were familiar with. They believed if they put out content, it would be treated equally to other content. And so Twitter puts out this statement that says, oh, well, it was a bug. It was a glitch in our system. So, I mean, does anyone really believe that? I mean, does anyone believe that during the Russia hoax, the only 4 members of Congress that happened to receive this particular bug or this particular treatment were myself, Meadows, Jordan, and Nunes? I mean, come on. And so I guess when whoever Twitter decided to do that, I guess they didn't count on Mark Meadows becoming the chief of staff at the White House one day. And I suspect that now Mark is far more educated on the subject, having himself been a victim, than had he not been. And I think he's got a unique perspective that will help advise the president. We see reporting coming out that the administration and the president are considering assembling thought leaders to go over what actions could be helpful in dealing with these online platforms. And I want to get into that policy analysis now. A lot of people don't know that Facebook and Twitter, these entities like you see Twitter disadvantaging the president, they enjoy liability protections that are not enjoyed by your local newspaper or your local TV station or Fox News or CNN or MSNBC. They have special benefits under Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act as digital platforms. You see, because they're not creating content for which they should be liable. They're not making decisions about content. They're simply saying, come one, come all with your content. And as a consequence of that, they're getting a bunch of protections. Well, now it really begs the question with what Twitter's doing, do they deserve that? Do they deserve it? And I would suggest that they don't. I mean, let's look first at what the Trump campaign said. This statement comes from the Trump campaign, Brad Parscale. We always knew that Silicon Valley would pull out all the stops to obstruct and interfere with President Trump getting his message through voters. Partnering with these biased fake news media fact checkers is only a smokescreen Twitter is using to try to lend their obvious political tactics some false credibility. There are many reasons the Trump campaign pulled all of our advertising from Twitter months ago, and their clear political bias is one of them. Again, that's a statement from Brad Parscale. Now, I don't think this is good for our country, for our politics, regardless of how you feel about a particular campaign. That is newsworthy in that it is an allegation that this is not legally a platform. And so I am currently working with my Republican colleagues on the Judiciary Committee to draft legislation to say that if you are going to opine as to the truth or falsity of that which is put on your platform for the sake of its viewers, you do not get the protections of Section 230. You are not a platform. You are doing something else. You are editorializing. And thus, if Twitter is going to, fact check President Trump, well, that really begs the question who those fact checkers are. And if there are groups of people that have shown bias against the president, if they're the same folks who told us that the president was a Russian agent, then I think that, the American people are being deprived of the opportunity to hear directly from their president. And so I'm not favoring a special attack on Twitter as a consequence of their action, but I do think that what they're doing ripens this real question in the law, and that is, should a digital platform that advances or has some discriminatory effect on content that is posted, should they get liability protections that are not provided others that are making those types of editorial-based decisions? I say no special carve-out in our law for big tech. I am currently working with House Judiciary members to revise Section 230 so that we do not have this type of election interference from companies like Twitter going forward. Are U.S. big tech companies going China first and selling out to America's biggest competitor? CNBC's Arun Karpal has a good write-up on this comprehensive report by Top 10 VPN, and it really ripens this question that I want to talk about on the podcast. U.S. technology companies, are they really going to be able to do business here and also do business for the Chinese Communist Party? I mean, are we okay?